Hey folks, thanks for joining me for another Passion for Sound audio review, and today a look at Uber dongles. A few of you have commented on the way I talk in these videos and that it's not exactly the same as how I sound in, say, an interview or similar, and I'm going to do my very best to start changing that. It's kind of come about from when I used to have to record while my son was sleeping in the room literally next door, and it's kind of just stuck there. So I'm going to do my very best to start changing that. Let me know how you'll find it and we'll see how we go. But for now, let's get into fondling some Uber dongles. And what I mean by Uber dongle here is that these are all the sorts of products that have both the dongle capability with a USB-C connection or similar, and also do Bluetooth. So as you can see here lined up on my desk, coming from furthest to closest, we've got the xDuoo Poke2. I've already reviewed that one, but it's come back around again because it fits the bill for this. We've also got the topping G5, the Hidizs AP80 Pro-X, another one I reviewed recently, the FiiO BTR7, and then finally the Shanling UP4 2022 model. And before we get into things like sound quality and pairings with different headphones, IEMs and things like that, what I wanted to start with was just give you a quick table on screen here that shows the key specifications for these, because I don't want to go into a whole lot of time pulling apart the differences, similarities of things that on paper maybe seem to make a difference, but in practice they often don't. As you'll see in the table, we start with the cheapest option being the Shanling UP4 22 and moving up to the xDuoo Poke2 as the top of the range. As you'll see, the power output into 32 ohms varies quite a bit, but other than that, they're all pretty similar. There's of course some variation of sample rates between the DSD512, DSD256, etc., but other than that, they're pretty close together in terms of the on-paper specifications, other than of course power. Two of these devices have standout features which does separate them from the rest, that being the G5 having a line input so it can actually just work as an amplifier, and also the AP80 Pro-X being able to give you two-way Bluetooth. So what that means is you can connect it up to your phone or your computer as a dongle and send sound from the AP80 Pro-X out to Bluetooth headphones, or you can flip it around the other way and send Bluetooth signal from your phone or your computer to the AP80 Pro-X and have it output a wired connection to your wired headphones. So it's very versatile in that regard, and it's one of the things that makes it a bit of a standout for me. As you can no doubt see though, a lot of what this is going to come down to in terms of which one's right for you is whether it can drive the headphones and the earphones that you want it to, and also of course how it sounds, which we'll get to in a second. Before we get there, I just want to clarify a couple of things, and that is that all of these work perfectly well with IEMs. I tried them with a few different IEMs and heard no sense of hiss or background noise. I had plenty of volume range, so there's no issues at all with IEM usage, and at the same time with almost all headphones, they're completely fine as well. I will talk about the power output when we get to each of these individually, but they're all pretty solid, with a couple of exceptions that do struggle. Driving something like a DCA Stealth, an Aeon Noir also from DCA, some of those can be a bit more difficult, which therefore means you've got no chance with the Susvara, a 1266 and HE6 SE. All those are going to be difficult. But for the most part, you can plug pretty much anything into these and they're going to do just fine. And so let's kick off starting about the actual devices themselves and the sound quality by starting at the bottom, as I tend to do, and working our way to the top. And so let's now start talking about the UP422 here. This is the smallest physical unit of the lot. It's also the cheapest and the least powerful, but that doesn't make it necessarily a bad option. Now, there have been some firmware issues, I believe, with the UP422. Shanling actually asked me to delay this one, but I didn't want to delay the whole video because everything else within this review I really want to get out to you soon. And the key thing here is that the firmware issues don't seem to have affected the performance for me. I think it's a great little device. I didn't experience any glitches, any pops, any problems, so it is one of those things that if you have heard that there are problems with this one, there is a firmware fix on the way. But at the same time, there's no reason not to grab one straight away. Based on my experiences, it's a lovely little device. To give you a quick tour of the UP4, on the front panel we've got a little light behind the glass, and it's this same lovely design as the original UP4, with the front and back being covered in this nice shiny glass. You've also got an NFC sensor in there, so you can pair it just by putting it to the back of your phone, which is a nice touch. On the side of the device we've got this rotary volume wheel, that's also a button. On the bottom we've got USB-C for data and or charging, and then on the top we've got a mode button which is going to allow you to switch through things like the gain levels. It's going to let you choose the filters as well, and then you've got balanced and single-ended outputs being 2.5mm for balanced and 3.5mm for single-ended. And so it's compact, but it is fully featured. Probably my only knock against the UP4 is it is lacking a little bit in power if you're looking to drive large and more difficult headphones like say a DCA Stealth. To put that into perspective, I tried this with both the Sennheiser HD820, which is a 300 ohm headphone, and also with the aforementioned DCA Stealth, and it drove them okay, but it was at maximum volume. And that's regardless of whether I was using Bluetooth or a wired USB-C connection. So don't buy this one expecting it to drive everything under the sun, but it's definitely an option if you've got more sensitive headphones or IEMs. And so let's talk a bit about the sound of the UP422, and that is to say it sounds good, it's solid. It's not a product where I'd come away raving about it, but at $120 it's really, really good. It produces a nice sense of separation of sounds within the soundstage. It's not an overly large soundstage, but it's got a good sense of space because of the separation of those individual sounds. The tonality is solid. There's not a sense of warmth or thickness, nor is it sterile and cold. It's just a really natural and honest sounding presentation. And so ultimately, after listening to the UP422 for a while, just in isolation, no comparisons at this stage, I felt like it was a solid device. There's absolutely nothing I would complain about with it. If somebody said they were going to go out and buy one, I'd say it's a good choice. But I didn't yet know if it was going to be as good a choice as some of the other options, given that you are going to be spending a bit more though on those other options that we've got here. And so that brought me around to my next option, which was the AP80 Pro-X. That's this guy here from Hidizs. Now I reviewed this one recently with its sort of semi-partner product, the DH80S, and I really liked the AP80 Pro-X, actually more so than the partner device. And I have to say that my fandom for this has only continued. With the AP80 here, and it is the Pro-X version, but I'm just going to call it the AP80. With this, I was able to drive the Stealths, the DCA Stealths, and the HD820s. Both of them were around about 70% volume and getting plenty loud enough, but I wouldn't say that it drove them to their maximum performance levels. And we'll get to that shortly when we get to some of the bigger, beefier devices that I think actually benefit by having more power on tap. To me, the sound from the AP80 is a bit crisper, a bit more defined than the UP4, and it's not just a case of it having more power and therefore more dynamics on the difficult headphones, because the same is true whether it's an IEM that I was driving or a full-size difficult headphone. So for me, the AP80 is the better sounding option because it does just define the sounds a bit better. I know for some people they're not going to be a fan of having a display on the device, they're going to prefer the simpler form factor of the UP4, and that's totally fine of course. But if you're happy to spend about $80 more and you're happy to have the display here, even if you're not going to use it as a digital audio player, which this happens to also be, if you're happy to make that decision, this is going to give you a better sense of definition in the sound, a greater sense of resolution, a greater sense of space and separation within the soundstage, and it's going to do all of that while maintaining the same general sort of neutral, natural tonality that you get from the UP422. So I think it's a great option. If it was me spending the money and I had anything up to $200 to spend, out of these two, I would definitely choose this, even though the form factor is maybe not as ideal. As I said before, maybe you don't need the screen, but it's the better sounding device. It's got the same type of outputs, being a 3.5 and a 2.5mm. And it also means you can carry around some local music on this for those times that maybe you don't want to pair it up to your phone. Maybe you're looking to save the battery life in your phone and use this as the source and keep your phone out of it. Whatever the reason, I actually think the AP80 Pro-X is such a versatile device, and it just happens to sound excellent too. And so for me at this point, assuming the budget allows, the AP80 Pro-X is in the lead, but for just $1 more if we're talking retail prices, you could get yourself the FiiO BTR7. The BTR7 here is more of a hybrid between the AP80 Pro-X and the UP422 because it does have a display, but it's definitely not a digital audio player. It is only a USB or Bluetooth DAC with headphone amp. And although there were no power specs shown anywhere that I could find on FiiO or retailer websites, as far as I can tell, this is more powerful than either of the two we've looked at so far because it was getting both the Stealths and the HD820s up to very, very comfortable listening levels. And what I mean by that is slightly louder than I might normally listen. It was getting up to those sorts of loud but comfortable listening levels at around about 35 on the volume. I think from memory it goes to 100. So there's plenty of headroom left, and it's getting plenty loud enough on those more difficult headphones. Before I talk about the quality of that sound though, let's do a quick tour of the device. Down the bottom we've got USB-C. There's an interesting feature here where you can switch on or off whether it takes power through USB-C. So if you don't want it to drain your phone, for instance, and or if you're looking to keep the power noise that may come out of a USB socket from getting into here, then you can switch off that charging switch and make it just a pure data feed only going in there. As we go up the side, you've got a volume rocker, you've got a selection button and a power button, and so those let you get into the menu to change things like the EQ settings, the filter. And so what we're starting to get here, and we also have on the AP80 Pro-X, is a little bit more customization of the sound compared to something like UP422. For me, they're not big features. I tend to keep things pretty much neutral. I don't tend to use EQs, DSPs, things like that, but it is there if you want it. And so that's where again I say that this is kind of like a hybrid between the UP422 being the very basic, simple device and a much more fully featured AP80. This keeps it simple in the fact that it's not a digital audio player as well, but otherwise gives you basically the same features as the AP80 in a form factor more similar to the UP4. Up on top of the BTR7, we've got a 3.5mm output for single-ended and a 4.4mm for balanced. And that's definitely my preference, is to use 4.4, but in a tiny form factor like these two, it's very hard to fit 4.4mm in. And so this is probably about as small as you can get while still having a 4.4mm connector. Getting to the sound of the BTR7, and for me it's a bit more polite than the AP80, maybe a little bit less dynamic as well. So even though it's got more power, it doesn't have the energy in the music that I do think the AP80 has, and that I really like the AP80 for. To be clear, the BTR7 still sounds excellent, but I was actually really surprised to hear the AP80 Pro-X sounding a little bit better to my ears. The BTR7 does provide a nice sense of width and separation in the soundstage, but not quite the same sense of depth that I think the AP80 is able to bring out. And the overall soundstage, whilst well separated, is a little bit more intimate compared to the AP80. So the AP80 pushes it back a little bit further from the listener, and therefore just gives you that slightly greater sense of overall space because it doesn't start as close to you, and it's also feeling a little bit larger. One of the things I was conscious of as I was trying the BTR7 and finding it just that bit more polite, a little bit less dynamic and exciting, was that the BTR7 uses THX amp modules. And time again, when I listen to any device that uses this THX nested feedback style of amplification, what I find is that they tend to kill some of these dynamics, some of kind of the naturality of the sound. And I definitely think that's true for the BTR7. It's the same as what I hear from the K9 Pro ESS, which is another wonderful device. But when stacked up next to a product that isn't using that same sort of nested feedback approach, I generally find the non-nested feedback, non-THX devices just sound a bit better. But to get a better sense of the BTR7 versus the AP80, I thought I'd put them both up with a single track and bounce back and forth between the two of them for some really direct comparisons. Up until this point, I'd literally just been listening to them for an extended period across a bunch of tracks, making some notes, getting a feel for each of them. But these two were close enough together that I really wanted to put them side by side on the exact same track with the exact same headphones and see what I heard. The track that I happened to end up using for this comparison was Boatyard by Joss Stone. And on this track, everything from the AP80 just sounds a bit more open, a bit more alive, and a bit more energetic from the AP80. There's just a very slight layer of lost, what I'd call probably realism from the BTR7. It just sounds a bit more muted, a bit less alive, and a bit more like a recording perhaps. It's really hard to put my finger on exactly what's going on with the BTR7. I don't exactly know how I would describe the differences other than what I've said, and I know they're a bit nebulous, those terms. They don't really describe what's going on in a way that's always easy to understand. But the AP80 just sounds better. It sounds alive, it sounds real, it sounds natural. It's got a sense of energy and therefore engagement. And so for me, if you were to put the two in front of me, I'd definitely pick up the AP80 Pro-X before I pick up the BTR7, unless there was a specific feature, the form factor, having a 4.4mm output, maybe needing more power. If any of those were true, then the BTR7 is still a good choice, but the AP80 Pro-X to me is just a slightly better sounding device. And so at this point, the AP80 Pro-X was seeming like a real winner because of its versatility and its sound quality, but I still had the two big beasts to go with, and that's the Topping G5 and the xDuoo Poke 2. When I first got these devices in, I had no sense of their pricing, and I have to admit I was pretty shocked to find that the Topping G5 here is significantly cheaper than the Poke 2 because they offer pretty similar options. They're both large form factor, fairly powerful Bluetooth and wired headphone amplifiers, wired meaning USB-C in both cases. The Topping G5 also offers you a line input, as I mentioned before, and so in many ways they're very similar products, but there's quite a gulf between them in terms of price. The G5 comes in at $300 so it's $100 more than either the BTR7 or the AP80 Pro-X, but then there's another $90 again to get to the xDuoo Poke 2, and yet to look at them on paper, there's not a huge difference between them. So I was really keen to see if somehow the Poke 2 was miles ahead better in terms of sound quality, if there was some features or functionality that were better. And the answer is actually that features and functionality wise, unless you actually want true balanced, which is really something that I would debate is necessary so long as you've got enough power, then unless you need true balance for some reason, I think the G5 has everything and more that the Poke2 offers, so it's all going to come down to sound. Before we get to sound, let me give you a really quick tour here. What we've got on the G5, and I think it's a lovely looking device, is we've got up the top here, we've got a volume knob. This is an analog volume knob that's also the switch to turn the device on and off, so it clicks when you first turn it. We've then got a line input, a 3.5mm, a line output 3.5mm, and a line output from 4.4mm, but it's not a balanced amplifier, so everything going on here is single-ended. It's just got the 4.4mm for convenience, and I'm personally totally fine with that. I've got no issues at all. I know some people would prefer a truly balanced design, but in my experience, particularly in recent times where there's been a lot of these sorts of devices coming out, in my experience, it really doesn't make enough difference. And so the G5 is fully single-ended versus the Poke2, which we'll get to shortly, being actually both single-ended and balanced. But to continue the tour of the G5, we've got this glass panel on the front, which is a bit of a fingerprint magnet now that I look at it. And under there, you can both see some of the circuitry, which is a little bit cool, but also there's an indicator light for when the device is on and when it's got a signal coming in. So that's going to tell you when it's in pairing mode, when it's got the connection for Bluetooth, or it's got the wired connection coming in and it's synced up from a USB point of view. And then down the bottom of the device, we've got multiple connections. We've got a charging port that is just purely for power, a data port which is purely for the data signal if you're using this as a USB DAC. Both of those are USB-C, by the way. And then we've got two sets of dip switches. One of them is for low, medium and high gain. So yes, this has 3 different gain modes, and I'll get to those in a moment. And then there's also the input selector switch, which allows you to move from being a Bluetooth DAC, a USB DAC, and of course taking a line in and using it purely as a headphone amplifier. And at that point, it basically becomes a Topping NX7, and that's great because I love the Topping NX7 as well. So we've got a well-featured, well-designed device here. I spoke about in the NX7 review. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of these shoulder guards up here, but at the same time, I understand why they're there. It's to stop you accidentally bumping and turning the volume when it's in your pocket, when you're handling it. So I'm not necessarily against having that there, but I'm also not a huge fan of it either. And then if we start to talk about sound quality, the first thing I want to mention is that this has got plenty of power for anything you're likely to use it with, including things like the DCA Stealth and the HD820 that I've already mentioned a couple of times. This was driving both of those in high gain mode at about 12 o'clock on the volume knob, so around about 50% volume, and there was still plenty of room to spare. In the case of the HD820, it was actually slightly below that, probably around 11 o'clock. But the point is, you've got plenty of power on tap for even slightly difficult headphones. Something that's very, very important for me to mention is that straight out of the box, this sounded like trash. It was horrible. And it's one of the first cases where I've really heard the difference of burn-in with a device like this. But the good news is the burn-in happened really fast. So we're talking 10 to 15 minutes of runtime, and this started to sound fantastic. Whereas for the first few minutes, I thought they'd absolutely made a dud. And for anyone who's wondering about why that would be, things like capacitors are designed, they're like little batteries, and so they actually have to fill with power and release that power. And there is an element of chemistry going on where as the power is cycling through them, they are actually kind of rearranging the chemicals on the inside. So it's completely explainable that there would be burn-in on a product like this. But the key thing I wanted to mention is that firstly, don't judge it the second you turn it on. It is going to sound like rubbish. Give it a few minutes to burn in, but also don't feel like you've got to give it 3 days before you listen to it. Just let it run, and within 10 to 15 minutes, it's going to start sounding great. Perhaps it's going to get even better after that, but the chances of hearing the difference between the 15-minute mark and the 3-day mark, I would say are very, very minimal. The bulk of that burn-in happens very fast. And so talking about the sound of the G5, once it had burned in, of course, and what I found listening to the G5, comparing it to everything I'd been listening to so far, was that it brought the sound of the mid-range forward a little bit. So it did make the sound just a little bit more intimate overall, but not in a congested or claustrophobic way, just that it was a touch closer. The presentation from it is quite left-right, so it's not giving you much depth, but it's got a good sense of space and separation within that left-right space. Speaking of separation, the sense of separation and the sense of detail retrieval is absolutely fantastic on the G5. It's a definite standout for me. It's got a wonderful sense of dynamics and clarity to it. And actually, as I think of it, this disproves what I said before about nested feedback amplifiers, because I'm pretty sure the G5 is using Topping's nested feedback design, and yet it sounds wonderful to me. So maybe it depends on how it's implemented, the exact parts and components they're using for it. Whatever the reason, the G5, like the Topping NX7, they're both exceptions to that rule, and they both sound wonderful. Comparing it back to what I heard earlier from the AP80 Pro-X, it's an even more energetic sound than the AP80 Pro-X, but I don't mean that in an energetic and fatiguing way. What I mean is that it's just got a better sense of clarity, dynamics, detail retrieval. Everything just comes a little bit more alive again. It brings out more of the textures, more of the subtle details of the music. But unlike some devices that can overdo that and make that kind of the star of the show and be distracting, I never found the G5 did that. The G5 was just giving me a wonderful sense of transparency, detail retrieval and resolution without making it distracting, artificial, anything that would take me away from just enjoying the music. And indeed with the G5, that's the thing that stood out to me the most, is that every time I plug it in, I just enjoy myself. And that's the mark for me of a great sounding device. And so far, the AP80 Pro-X has been one option that does that. The G5 does it and does it even better. You're sacrificing some dollars to get there, and also the physical size of it is less convenient than the AP80 Pro-X, but both of them do a great job, with the G5 doing it even better again. One thing I should mention about the G5 before I go on and talk about the Poke 2 is that I did try the gain settings on the G5, and I would probably recommend against using the low gain. If you've got one of these and you're running it with IEMs, you can still very comfortably use medium gain in my experience. There was still plenty of volume range to work with on earphones like the Sennheiser IE600, IE900, also the T-Audio Monarch Mark II I think I tried. There was no problems with volume range on those. But what I did find was that when I went to low gain, it kind of did start to squash the sound a bit. It did compress the sense of dynamics and engagement and liveliness, not to the degree that it got dull and boring and lifeless, but it wasn't as good as in medium or high gain mode. And I'm guessing that's because when you start to go to low gain on some of these devices, particularly when there's 3 gain levels, what they often do is they start to go into negative gain. And in order to do that, they have to use extra feedback to kind of squash the signal down further, and that can often kill the dynamics. So I'm guessing that's what's going on here. It's not to say that G5 sounds dreadful in low gain mode, but it definitely to me sounds better in medium and high. And so with that one said, let's talk now about whether it's worth spending the extra $90 to go up to the Poke 2, or if the G5 is good enough. Going to the Poke 2, and as I said, I've reviewed this one before, so I'm not going to go into full depth and detail about the features and functions and the ins and outs. It's got pretty much everything that the G5 does, other than being a digital volume control. It does have a built-in EQ with a couple of basic settings. They're all presets. There's no custom EQ on there. And there's a couple of filters to choose from, so there's a little bit of versatility from the Poke 2, but it's not a huge departure from what the G5 offers. But with the Poke 2, the first things to highlight are that firstly, power-wise, it was driving those same difficult headphones at around about 69 out of 100 in high gain, so it's probably got a little bit less actual drive than the G5 does, but certainly still it had plenty of juice to spare. When I started really listening to the Poke 2 versus the G5 though, what I started to hear was that there's a definite sense of a mutedness to the Poke 2. It doesn't have the liveliness, the naturalness, the energy and the engagement that the G5 does. And in fact, I'd probably go so far as saying the Poke 2 sounds just a little bit blunted, a little bit flat by comparison. I don't mean physically flat so much as just the sound doesn't have life, it doesn't have bounce to it. I also found that the G5 was giving a greater sense of space and separation, and so overall to me, the G5 was the clearly better sounding device as I flipped back and forth, but before I made any final conclusions on that, I did want to give them a direct head-to-head comparison with one consistent track, and that track ended up being Wanted Man by Need to Breathe. From the Poke 2, the opening guitars in this track just lacked a sense of resonance and richness that they should have. If you think about a guitar, every time the strings get strummed on a guitar, the body of the guitar starts to resonate with the various harmonics from those strings, and to me it was like the Poke 2 was somehow killing that just a little bit. The G5 let it come forward, be natural, actually resonate properly, whereas somehow there was something going on in the Poke 2 that just deadened those harmonics a bit. In the busy middle section of this track, where there's all sorts of stuff going on, I also felt like the Poke 2 was struggling to keep everything separate and everything really clearly defined in the mix. In amongst all that, the vocals from the Poke 2 sounded much more like a recording compared to the very natural and lifelike sound from the G5. And perhaps the icing on the cake for me was that the tom-toms in the drum kit from the G5 had a sense of texture to them. I've talked about this in some other reviews where sometimes you can almost hear the textures of the drum skins, and I don't mean that from some sort of crazy golden ear perspective. My point is that sometimes you can hear the resonance and the character of the actual drums. From the G5 I could hear that on this recording, whereas from the Poke 2 it was a little bit lost. So the Poke 2's drums were one-dimensional, it was just a sound, it was just a percussive boom, whereas from the G5 there was a sense of texture, there was a sense of nuance to the drums, and the G5 did that beautifully, the Poke 2 couldn't keep up. And so for me this was really interesting. I liked the Poke 2 when I heard it in isolation. I said in my review for it that it was a good solid product. I wasn't raving about it, but it was solid. Whereas for me the G5 is just another level above it, and it's $90 cheaper. So after fondling all these Uber dongles, for me it was a pretty clear-cut case that If you only want a very small, compact device that's nice and simple, I think the Shanling UP4 is great. It's really more suited to sensitive headphones and IEMs than it is to full-sized, kind of larger, more difficult headphones, but it does a lovely job and it sounds fantastic, particularly at its $120 price tag. But if you're really looking to maximize sound quality, then the two choices for me are the AP80 Pro-X if you want to keep it compact, or if you've got a bit more budget and a bit more space to work with, say for instance you're looking for something that's more going to sit on a desk at work rather than be a pocketable device, then the G5 is absolutely brilliant. None of this is to say that the BTR7 is bad in any way. It's a great device if you've already bought one. Be very happy with your choice. In many ways, it's an easier interface and interaction than the AP80, so there's reasons that I would still say the BTR7 is relevant and a good choice. But if you're happy with the form factor and the functionality of the AP80, I would just lean that way a little bit. And as I said before, if you've got the extra budget and the space to work with, the G5 is just a killer. And so probably after all of this fondling of Uber dongles, the only one for me that was really a disappointment is actually the Poke 2. I now come away thinking that it's a bit overpriced for what it is, given the competition. Again, it's one of those products that in isolation is completely fine. If you've got one already, it's a solid choice. Just as I said in my original review, it's a good, solid unit that sounds nice. But if you're currently in the market and about to make the decision, save yourself $90 and get yourself the G5. Ignore the fact that it's not fully balanced. It's totally irrelevant because it still sounds better than the balanced output of the Poke 2. And so hopefully all of this has given you some clarity as to which of these Uber dongles you might want to fondle. I want to say a huge thanks to Shanling, Hidizs and Apos Audio for making this review possible. All of these units were sent through by one or other of those. And it's great when it gives me a chance to do all these comparisons and share with you how they all stack up, so hopefully you can make really informed decisions. As always, if you have found this review useful, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button and consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.